What's up, everybody? Welcome. Welcome on in, everybody. We'll start shortly. Just waiting on a few more people. How's everybody doing today? What makes a good strategy game? Maybe good strategy. But strategy, well, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. Oh. We got lots to talk about. It's a subject I feel very strongly about. First time I got Discord notification on time. What happens? Do you get them late? I have noticed the deliverability of Discord notifications is going down, which I figured it would. Like, you know, it's only a matter of time. If you give people too many notifications, they turn them off. And if they're in 30 servers, even if it's once a week, that's 30 notifications a week. And then people turn them off, and then nobody gets notifications. So they limit the reach. One hour late. Oh, well, that sucks. Good news is, since we switched to video, the video recording is always available. All the Discord stuff was harder to access. Secret to good strategy is replay and short levels. That sounds like the secret to your personal preference of games. There's a plugin for, XCOM with the Long War and all that stuff. A lot of people make strategy games last a very long time. Rick is not showing up today. It's just me. He said he had a really good idea for Draggy Dog, and then we haven't seen him for 3 days. So. The new Starship Troopers game, we can look at it. I haven't seen that yet. Isn't personal preference a big part of why we make so many different kinds? And yeah, it is. And that's a great perspective. I think that's why there's genres. I think that's why there's so many different types of games. All right, let's get started. No, Rick. Maybe he's hiding around here somewhere. I don't know. But welcome everybody to Divulgy Livecast. Today we're going to be talking about what makes a good strategy game. I'm Tim Roswick, and Rick Davidson is out for the evening. So it's just me. I was going to get a guest on, but, you know, stuff happens. I got busy. It's more complex than it sounds. Today we're going to talk about what makes a good strategy game. It's going to be a little bit different because I'll just be honest. Without Rick's comedic relief and me being let loose on live stream, I get to talk about exactly what I think about strategy games. And I've been waiting for this rant for a very long time. So if you're here for the banter, you're not going to get any. If you're here to learn what makes a good strategy game from the perspective of Tim Ruswick, I've got quite a bit to share with you. And we can go over a lot of stuff, a lot of concepts and ideas. We may or may not next week have a turn-based strategy course launching. So I don't have any links, I don't have any discounts, but keep an eye on the email list if you're on there for cool discounts and stuff like that for the pre-launch. Background music is still on. Do you not want it on? You know what I've started doing, by the way? I've started taking my meetings with music in my headphones. It chills me out for some reason. Maybe the silence messes with me. Maybe it's the noise canceling. I don't know. But the dead silence bothers me. I turned it down a little bit. All right, so let's get started. Ideally, in a perfect world, I would have like a presentation. Like I'd give a GDC talk, right? Like I'd give a talk on with PowerPoint and all that stuff. But really, what I got is something extra special. I have a Photoshop window, so that I'm going to draw stuff to, and I'm going to show you kind of how I think about things. So, first things first. One of the main things that I think you need is why is this vertical? Okay, well, it wouldn't be a GameDev.tv stream if we didn't have something off. Where is the setting for this? I know there's a setting for this. Okay, well, this is how we're doing it. Okay. These are even weird too. Wait, is this text? There we go. Look at that. I know what I'm doing. All right. The first thing you need for a good strategy game is depth. That's what we're going to talk about first. All right. Have people received Game Jam, receive their free courses? Most of them should have it. If you do not have your course, you need to contact support@GameDev.tv. How do I define depth in a strategy game? Because someone brought up complexity before, and we're going to be talking about depth and complexity and all that stuff. So I want to define depth for you so you know what I'm talking about. So depth is the number of viable options at any one time. Now this is important. Let's bump down the font a little bit. Now, what makes a good strategy game, right? Interesting decisions. Good, interesting decisions. Fun, immersive, amusing, tactical decisions, right? Any strategy game has interesting decisions. They're important. Even simple ones like auto battlers or stuff like that, you still have to control where the unit moves or, which units to put in battle, that kind of stuff. So because they require interesting decisions, you need depth. You need some form of depth. And depth is the number of viable options at any one time. Now, the number of viable options obviously directly correlates to the number of decisions that you can make at any one time, right? Something I want to point out here, though, is a lot of people, when they're building a game, what they do is they add more stuff, right? So they say, hey, you know what? This would be a way better strategy game if it had, I don't know, an inventory system, right? But what they actually end up adding most of the time is not depth. What they end up adding is complexity. Now, the easiest way to add depth to your game is by adding complexity. If you've got a cool system that you want to design and a strategy, and let's say it's a turn-based tactics game, right? If you move and you can attack and that's all you can do in a strategy game, okay. But what if all the units had abilities? Okay, well then, now you can move and attack, but everybody has a different ability. That's kind of interesting. You've added complexity, but you've also added depth because you've increased the amount of systems in a game with complexity. But by doing that, you've also increased the number of viable options at any one time. I am really sorry if this goes like full on GDC talk boringness. Okay, so you guys got to stop me. Feel free to ask any questions along the way too. So easiest way to add depth is by adding complexity. And I'm just gonna, oops, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna duplicate this so we can just kind of know what we're talking about. Number of systems in a game. If I can get this right, oh my God. Number of systems in a game. Okay, so depth is the number of viable options at any one time. So for example, there's a couple of keywords here that I want to highlight. So the number of options. Okay, so if I move my unit, this is like strategy of a strategy. Exactly. And like I said, I wish I was more prepared for this, but I wasn't. We had a lot going on recently. I did the Steam Fest last week and we had, lots of stuff internally. Okay, so the number of options is important, right? Let's skip the word viable for a second. So the number of options. Now, if I am moving my unit, let's look at an XCOM screenshot so you guys can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. Visual aids. Okay, so if you look at like XCOM, for example. So I've got my character highlighted. And let's look at something that's a little more relatable. So in this shot, for example, this is my number of options. If assuming I wanted to take this shot and I wanted to shoot this guy, I've got all of these options down here. I can shoot him. I can use my abilities. I can use a melee attack. I can overwatch, so I can sit there and wait for them to move, or I can throw a grenade. Those are my number of options at this specific junction with this specific game, right? But here's where this other part comes into play. So number of options is important, but number of viable options is also important. And here's what I mean by viable. So a lot of games will let you make lots of decisions, right? So they'll give you all these options, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll have a number of options to make this shot. But if 2 of these kill the unit and the other 3 don't at that exact time, those are not viable options because they are technically worse than all the other options. And in a good strategy game, you don't want options. You want viable options. Because I don't know about you guys, but how many of you guys have played an actual game where you're given a bunch of choices, but you just end up doing the same thing over and over again, right? You just end up like the good example is an RPG. If you need to level up, what's the best way to level up? It's usually like killing the rats at level 3 over and over and over again, right? It's boring, but in that game, that's like the main viable option for leveling up very quickly and over leveling your character. And those games systemically shouldn't be designed that way because they're making the most fun way to play the game, or they're making the most viable way to play the game the most boring way to play the game. And strategy games, I think, have an example and a opportunity to kind of give you a number of viable options. So it's not just about how many options you have at a given time. It's about how many of them are viable. And so, like I said, a lot of people create this number of viable options. First of all, they ignore the word viable, right? And they just go to number of options. And then they usually do that by adding complexity to the game. So what if we added an inventory system? What if we added more stuff, right? What if we added a movement system? What if we did a bunch of stuff? Someone brought up Pokemon. That's a perfect example. So Pokemon doesn't have a whole lot of depth in their combat system. there's a lot of randomness there, which we'll talk about in a second, because randomness is a huge part of strategy, and there's a lot of stuff there. But what you'll notice if you play Pokemon as much as I have, okay, at least in the Game Boy games and stuff like that, you kind of end up just spamming one attack over and over again. You over level a character, you end up spamming an attack over and over again, and that's kind of your main attack, and that's just what you do. Because there's not a lot of viable options. Now, when you're in the trainer battles or the elite battles, for example, or whatever, you might have to pay attention to the typing a little more, right? But generally, you can just spam your main attack, and you're good. That's a lack of viable options. You've got options, right? In Pokemon, you have options. You have all 4 attacks. You have all 6 Pokemon. You can attack with any of them. But if one of them is always clearly better, you don't have a lot of viable options. So that, to me, is one of the first keys of really good strategy games, is the number of viable options. You should never have one clear winner in a decision for a strategy game, ever. And that's, again, all of this is the Tim Russwick philosophy on strategy games. Okay, so I'm not the end all be all source on this. Okay, but I just happen to really like strategy games, and I happen to like designing them. So that's the main thing I wanted to point out. This is a very big topic in strategy games, and I think this is something that a lot of people get wrong. Is they try to add complexity when what they want to add is depth. And then even when they do try to add depth, they try to add number of options, and they forget about that word viable, right? So that's really, really important. It's hard to do. It's very hard to do avocado fire, and that is why a lot of people don't do it. The irony of this is that it's really actually easier to add complexity. It's way easier to just dump a bunch of stuff in a game than to sit down and think about how all the systems interact with each other. It really is. And that's why a lot of people go this route. They just say, oh, it's kind of boring. Let's add an inventory system, or it's kind of boring. Let's, make it, change stuff. So I think that's why a lot of people go that route. And I understand, believe me, I've been through the depths of game dev. I understand completely why somebody would take the easy route. I'm not saying you never should. That's definitely a viable option in game dev. But that's something to keep in mind, right? Okay, so the next part of this, I'll create a line there. This is the best PowerPoint ever. I got to show Rick this after he gets back. Rick, look what I did. I invented a new stream format. So if you have any questions on this, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I can answer them as much as I can. So the next part of this is variance. Okay. And so variance, easiest way to add variance. Well, let's define variance first. So variance is how different things are over time, or how things change, right? How things change over progression. Let's say how much things change over progression. Because you can have a lot of variance, you can have a little bit of variance. Sounds like a philosophy that can be applied to a lot of genres. I think it can. I really do think it can. But obviously, the type of genre that you're in, you may not want. So, for example, you may not want some depth or complexity. Like casual games, for example, a lot of people are not interested in having super deep games. They want to just make decisions, and a lot of people will add lights and effects and juice and all that stuff, and you can make things really exciting without actually having any interesting decisions there, right? It's going to be applied to fighting games, RPG, class-based shooters, a lot of stuff. Pokemon is an example. That would be something you would change within the game to add more depth. That's a really good question, Joshua. And I will answer that at the end. How about that? After we get through everything, so I can kind of frame that within kind of what we went over. What I change. Pokemon. I'll add that down. Okay, so variance is how much things change over progression. Now, progression can be in a level, right? So I went to the spot and I picked up the sniper rifle, and now my game is completely different. It can also be multi-level. So after I beat that level, I got some XP, I leveled up, I got a new ability. Things are different now, right? Because I have that ability, or my movement speed increased or whatever. But it can also be multi-run. So like in roguelites, this is really getting popular right now with a lot of procedurally generated game, is every time I do a run, the game is completely different because it procedurally generates, right? Battleborn Tactics demo incoming. I've been trying. Okay, listen, I want to mention Battleborn Tactics like 25 million times. Trust me, because I'm using all of this philosophy in my own game design. And I want to keep mentioning it because that's what I'm working on. But I know I don't want to jam it down people's throats. So I'm going to try to minimize Battleborn Tactics talk in this talk. But I am working on a strategy game called Battleborn Tactics, which you can search right now. It's got a demo if you want to play it. So variance is important because even if you have depth and even if you have complexity, if you have minimal complexity and maximum depth, which is ideal, by the way, I think the ratio between depth and complexity is important, because if you have a lot of complexity and no depth, your game is going to be really confusing and hard to understand. If you have a lot of depth and very little complexity, people are going to be able to get into it very easily and play a really interesting game, and it's more likely to hook them. But variance is important because even if you have these two things, you don't have a replayable experience. So for example, if I've got a number of viable options, but those options are the same every time I play the game, like in a story-based game, for example, I may play it once or twice. I may go back after I've finished it to figure out what the alternate ending is, but I don't want to play it again, right? So variance is the change over time. So that's what keeps players engaged, because the problem is a lot of systems are solvable. So even if you give somebody a number of viable options, very quickly they will start to see patterns and get better at the game, right? And over time, the perception of depth in a game goes down because they understand the game better, if that makes any sense. So variance is important because it keeps them on their toes. It keeps them experiencing new things. And if you don't have variance, your game can become boring. Someone brought up the fact that Pokemon has a ton of variance, but little depth. And that's a great example. So Pokemon is really interesting because you got to catch them all. There's a ton of Pokemon to catch. And you keep thinking like, oh, that new Pokemon I catch might have an awesome move that'll decimate everybody, right? Well, I think that because that's what I'm interested in playing Pokemon for. But I know some people just want to collect all the Pokemon, or some people like certain types or whatever, right? So I think all three of these concepts are important to varying degrees. Generally, I think complexity is bad. Generally, I think depth is good, and generally, I think variance is required. Okay, I don't necessarily think you need depth in a game. In a strategy game, I do, but I think you can make a game without depth. You can make an interactive story. There's plenty of games, but I think you need some sort of variance in this day and age for a game that someone's going to play more than once, right? So that's really, really important part of this. So there's one other concept that I want to cover in strategy games that I could get you guys familiar with. And this is something that I had realized for a while, but I didn't have a word for it. And this was information horizon. Actually, I heard this term on Keith for Gun podcast. I don't know if he invented it or not, but that was where I first heard the term, and I was like, you know what, that encapsulates exactly how I feel. So let's look at chess. So what is an information horizon? Well, if you look at a chessboard, let's look at, can we see one in progress? Can we see a big one in progress? No. Okay, whatever. Or open up a stock photo. There you go. There's a stock photo chess. Only the highest quality things here on the stream. So chess has a lot of depth. There is a lot of things that can happen on this board, right? It's got a little bit of complexity. Generally, the depth to complexity ratio is very high. So it's got a lot of depth. So it's got, like, for example, 10 units of depth to 2 units of complexity. A lot of people add 1 unit of complexity to 1 unit of depth, if that makes any sense. I'm giving you the recipe to game dev here. But right now we're talking about information horizon, okay? So the information horizon in chess is infinite. What is an information horizon? The information horizon is the end of the data that you can extrapolate by looking at the board state, if that makes any sense. So the reason computers are good at chess is because chess is a mathematical game, and I can look at a board in any state. Well, I can't do this because I'm not that smart, but a computer can do this. They can look at a board in a specific state and look at all the viable moves that their opponent has, right? So they know that the knight can move here and kill this pawn. The knight can also move here and kill whatever the hell that thing is called, right? They know what all the moves are. They know what all the units do, and there's no randomness. There's no variance at all in this game. So this game is it's not predictable because there's so many viable options, which makes it a very good game, but it is simulatable, if that makes any sense. So let's simplify this down into the basic form so you guys can kind of understand what I'm talking about. So when I play chess, I stare at the board. I take like 6 minutes for my turn, and everybody gets mad at me. Okay, that's the simplest version of it. And the reason is because there's too much to think about, right? There's way too much to think about, and I hate it. I actually hate chess. And I hate chess because there's too much information on the board. Now, a lot of games, especially turn-based games, turn-based strategy games, they'll take a game like this, but then they'll add dodge and crit to it, right? So if you guys aren't familiar with dodge and crit, dodge is the idea that you can attack somebody and they can dodge out of your attack. So like you can miss the attack. And then crit is the idea that you can hit them, but you can get a critical hit, which actually does like 1.5 damage, right? Information horizon is a term used in behavior research. Okay, perfect. So it's not a term I was familiar with until I found it. I was like, oh my God, this is perfect. So maybe I'm using that specific term wrong. I don't know, but I know I'm trying to explain the concept here. So if we just played chess and we had a dodge percentage and a crit percentage, it would drastically alter the game, right? Because suddenly I can't see more than a couple turns, right? I can't see out that far. And that's where the information horizon, that's what the concept of that is, right? Like you can't see out as far as the horizon. So a lot of games end up adding randomness or variance to their game to reduce the information horizon. And the more you can reduce the information horizon, you do take away depth. But you add in, but you also reduce complexity, if that makes sense. So I hate to use my game as an example, but this is a really good example because this is something I've worked very hard on. So in Battleborn Tactics, you've got kind of this chessboard layout, and actually part of it was inspired by chess, right? But you've got this dodge and crit system, and then you've also got these abilities of all these different things. But I've worked really hard to make it to where I can't see multiple turns, right? So one, you've got the AI that does unpredictable things. But two, even if I make this attack right here, I'm not positive that I'm going to be able to kill this unit because I might miss, right? And if I miss, that's going to throw off my whole strategy. So I have to take that into account when I'm actually making that decision. And now randomness is something that is actually kind of important in strategy games, but there's different types of randomness as well. And again, I apologize if I'm throwing way too much info on you guys. So let me know, and I'll do my best to kind of reduce the complexity of this talk. But this is why variance is important, though, because without variance, you've got a really long information horizon, and it can be very overwhelming for people, right? Just because you have infinite decisions and infinite viable decisions in a game like chess doesn't mean that it makes for a better strategy game. Sometimes it actually makes for a worse strategy game for some players because they get really overwhelmed by the choices, and the gravity of the choice is so large that they don't want to make any choices, right? So it's really, really important because I'm trying to make a casual strategy game. So I want to reduce the information horizon as much as possible because I don't want people to overstress their turns. I just kind of want them to move and attack, right? And so because of that, I have to kind of obscure the future, if that makes any sense. And that's because my design philosophy is I want people to think less about their turns. If you want people to think more about their turns, you want to think mathematically like chess, because then this game you can predict and you can simulate kind of every move, right? Analysis paralysis. Exactly. And that's exactly what happens to me when I play chess. It's not that I hate chess, it's that there's so many good options that I'm just paralyzed by analysis, right? Without randomness, loss is your fault. And some people like that, right? Some people maintain that strategy games with zero randomness are the superior form of strategy games. And they like those games. And that is completely, they are allowed to like those games. I do not, because I stress out over this stuff so much. So my design philosophy is to reduce the information horizon and present somebody with a series of interesting decisions for that turn. But I don't want them to really look past that turn, if that makes any sense. Whereas chess, you kind of have to. If you're not thinking 3-4 moves ahead, you're going to lose, right? Every time. So that's just important. And again, that's one of those things that is personal preference, right? So all that being said, let's talk about the types of randomness, because people are bringing up randomness in the chat, and we talked about variance. So I want to bring up the types of randomness because I think it's an important design concept. Okay. So I always get these wrong, so I might get these wrong, but I think I've got this. There are two types of random. There's a really good Keith Burgun podcast on this, and there's also a really good Game Maker's Toolkit video on this. There's input randomness. Then there's output randomness. Okay. And the idea behind these is simple. That one of them, input and output. So input randomness, I might get these backwards because these are very confusing terms, by the way. So you're gonna have to look this up. But input randomness is randomness that happens before you make a decision. So if you give me a random character effect on my character, and now I'm poisoned, right? Because I had a random chance to get poisoned. And so I get poisoned, but now it's my turn and I can choose to do whatever I want. That could be input randomness because now it happened before I made my decision. And so therefore I can factor it into my decision, right? Output randomness is the opposite. Output randomness is the stuff that happens after you've made your decision. So we brought up XCOM before. There is a hit percentage in XCOM, right? So if I hit the shoot button here, and I take this hit, and it says, let's say, a 90% chance. I hit the fire weapon button, and then the game tells me whether or not I hit. So I've already made my decision, right? But now the game says whether or not it succeeded. Players tend to hate output randomness because they can't really deal with it. Now, there's an argument that output randomness is just input randomness for the next turn in turn-based strategy games, which that's a viable argument, right? But one of the things that output randomness does, and again, this is such a general concept that we have to use a specific example like XCOM, and if you haven't used XCOM, if you haven't played XCOM, I highly recommend that you do, just because it's a solid strategy game. But it's a solid version of everything that I'm talking about here. But if I take this shot, and let's say it's a 90% chance to hit, and I miss, it's very likely that all these other enemies are going to shoot, and this guy may die. And this guy may die as a result of randomness. Okay, he may literally just, I don't have him anymore because of randomness. And that's extra frustrating when it happened after I made my decision. Now, if he, for example, were to get shot at the beginning of the turn based on a random chance, and then I have a chance to act on that before the enemies kind of shoot. I'm talking about XCOM 2 specifically. If I have a chance to act on that before the enemies shoot, it actually feels better. So a lot of players, for example, will say that they hate randomness in games, but usually what they mean is they hate output randomness. They hate randomness that they don't have a chance to control, right? And that's fair. Now, games like Into the Breach use this interestingly. They use randomness in a really cool way. Into the Breach. So Into the Breach is actually one of the inspirations for Battleborn, because it's got this whole like chess-like grid thing. But Into the Breach, there is no randomness in this game, except for when you shoot a enemy, or I believe it's when you're about to kill a tower. The tower and in Into the Breach, I should just explain this so you guys know. Basically, your lives, your power grid goes down by 1 when one of these towers gets destroyed. And if this is basically your health bar. So if you lose this many towers over a run, you lose the game. Now, when you push an enemy into a tower or a power grid or a building or whatever you want to call it, it can hit your power grid, but it has a small chance to not hit your power grid, right? And that's a really cool variance technique because it's in the player's favor, if that makes sense. So XCOM 2, for example, their variance is on their weapon systems. So it's usually not 100% shot, which means almost always the randomness is hurting the player. But in Into the Breach's case, the only randomness in the game can potentially help the player, which is really, really cool, right? And so I want you to think outside the box when you're thinking about variance and input randomness and output randomness and all this stuff, because the type where the randomness is in the decision tree, but also whether or not it helps or hurts the player is super important, right? And it's something to take into account for sure when you're designing systems and strategy games and all that stuff, if that makes any sense. I love Into the Breach. Yeah, it's a pretty great game. Are the stages kind of randomly generated? You never have exactly the same arrangement. In XCOM 2, I believe XCOM 2 has some procedural generation to it. I think they are pre-made maps, but the buildings change and the rotation orientation and stuff changes, and the day and night cycle changes, and it starts you from different points. So with all that together, it feels procedural, even though they're kind of designed, if that makes sense. Which, by the way, a lot of procedural generation is not actual procedural generation. It's just kind of templatey. So Into the Breach does this. They design like 200 templates, and they just pull from a random template that they hand designed. And Battleborn does this, by the way, too. I hand design the templates, and then I randomize what goes on each location. But that way I can make sure that it's controlled, and I can make sure the enemies spawn. And it's just a lot easier than procedurally generating an algorithm to figure out the interesting decisions that come from strategy games. Because that's the other thing. It's a lot easier to procedurally generate a shooter level, for example, than a strategy game, because strategy games all rely on units and well, they don't all rely on units, but they rely on decisions, and they rely on placement of objects and all that stuff too. So it's a really complex topic, I think. I am fresh off XCOM 2, and it positively feels like 80% shots miss 50 of the time. The game may be fair, but perception isn't. Okay, so that's another good topic. Let's dive into that. So we're talking about what makes a good strategy game, right? So we've got variance, We've got input output randomness. Now here's the other part of this. You guys are gonna be like, what? But this is an important part of strategy games. Fake random. Okay. This is gonna seem weird at first. All right. I promise you this is very important to strategy games. So the way that XCOM calculates randomness and the way that a lot of strategy games calculate randomness is different than actual random. And the problem comes with people's perception of probability. So that was, I don't know why I Googled the word probability. I don't know what I expected. I don't know what I expected to see. How likely something is to happen. Okay, that's what probability is. I planned that. If I flip a coin and I get heads, and I flip another coin and I get heads, a lot of people's perception of random is that the more heads that they get, the more likely they are to get tails, if that makes any sense. But when you flip a coin, it is exactly 50% chance every time. Actually, technically, somebody did some math on this, and apparently flipping a coin is like 50.5% likely to land on heads just because of weight difference on a quarter or something like that. I don't know. Look it up. But the actual human perception of randomness is different than actual probability. So it's one of the reasons why gambling works, right? So people go to casinos and stuff like that, and they'll gamble on roulette, and it'll land on red like 3 times in a row. And then people were like, oh my God, I really feel like black is coming. Oh my God, red is 10 times in a row. I feel like black is like, and they'll use that as their logic. Like, it hit red 10 times in a row. There's no way it can hit red again, right? It just can't. But in reality, the probability of something happening, especially if it's a 50-50 chance, is exactly the same every time. It is not cumulative. But humans don't seem to grasp that concept. And I've even seen people that understand that conceptually, so they know that the probability is the same every time. But it feels bad. It feels like if you miss 3 times in a row, you should hit on the 4th time, right? Like there's no chance, there's no reason for it to miss that many times in a row. So that being said, XCOM actually has miss protection built in. XCOM 2 does. So if you shoot a shot, and I could be getting this wrong. I believe it's XCOM. But there's plenty of other strategy games that do this. They're not the only one either. But you can't actually miss, or the percentage chance to miss goes down every time you miss. So like, for example, if you shoot a weapon and you miss your shot, the next time, even though it shows the same percentage to hit, you actually have less likelihood to miss, if that makes any sense. Because they know that feels really, really bad. The other thing is these percentages lie. These are not accurate percentages. And that's also a probability thing, because when players see a 90% chance, for some reason, they think that 90% is practically the same thing as 100. They're just like, oh, it's a 90% chance to hit. Boom, I'm going to shoot, right? So they just automatically assume that they're going to hit. And it makes sense, right? Our brains aren't built to be mathematical machines. So you have to take into account the human element of your strategy games as well, because 90% does feel like 100. So this is where it gets tricky, because if players understand exactly how your system works, they'll exploit it. If they know that in your code, when it says 90%, it's actually 100% chance, they will exploit that to hell. So a lot of the stuff has to kind of be hidden to keep up the mirage and the interestingness of the game. So lying in percentages is something that game designers do quite a bit, and I do it in Battle Barn as well. My percentages to hit are generally 10 to 20% higher than they show. So if it shows an 87% chance, or it shows a 77% chance, it's closer to a 97% chance. I don't know the exact math, and again, I don't want anybody exploiting it, so I'm not going to share it. But it's generally giving them more likelihood to miss, or putting things in the player's favor, basically, right? The other thing is that miss protection is really important. You don't want players missing a bunch of times in a row. Even if probability-wise it would say that that's totally cool, it's a negative effect. It feels bad, and you don't want it happening multiple times in a row because it's a good way to get people to bounce off your game. So that's an important point too, is that randomness shouldn't be pure randomness. It should be fake random. The other part of that is there's a lot of ways to generate random, right? So there's something called weighted random, which you basically, I assign red 100, I assign black 50, I assign white 75, and those are the probability weights that each one of those colors will come up. So there's weighted random. You should look into that if you're thinking about that kind of stuff. I use weighted random, for example, on my map, in Battle Barn Tactics, there's a roguelike map, and if I just purely randomize these, there ends up being like 7 in a row of like one of them and like 5 hearts, and then it just looks really weird. So I actually use weighted random, and I give all of these nodes a similar weighted chance. Some of the nodes have less of a weight because they're more powerful, so they appear less often, but I use weighted random for this sort of thing. And then the other part of that is I forget what it's called, but there's basically like a deck of cards type of random. So rather than 50% chance yes or no, for example, you might have 10 things and you put them sort of in a deck of cards, and you shuffle up the deck of cards and you pull one after the other. So it ensures that all of them are going to be played. They're just played in a random order. And a good example for this would be like hit sound effects, for example. So let's say you have 10 hit sound effects, and every time you hit, it plays a random one. You can say play random sound effect, right? Which I've done. But sometimes, literally 5 times in a row, it'll play the same hit sound effect, and it feels really weird. So if you randomize them in the deck of cards kind of deal, it'll play all of the 10 sound effects, but it'll play them in random order every time. And that kind of feels good because that ensures that they're always different and it never duplicates the same, if that makes any sense. So that's a lot of stuff on randomness, but randomness is a huge topic, and it's a huge draw with and without replacement. Yeah. So that's I forget what it's called. There's a term for it, but there's an actual, it's called a table or something. But sorry, I don't remember that. There's a fair random asset in the Unity store, which can implement that card like randomness. Yeah. So that's stuff to look into if you're really looking into randomness, because randomness is really cool. I think, like I said, it reduces the information horizon, right? And it makes things more exciting, because for humans, anything that's predictable becomes less exciting, right? It really does. That's the nature of just how humans work. Once they figured something out, they're just not as interested in it. And that's kind of why people fall off of games in general, is because they've kind of seen everything there is for a game to see. And sometimes they think that they've seen everything there is to see, so they fall out, right? And they're done playing because it's all kind of samey. So randomness is really important to keep players engaged, because it kind of adds interesting mechanics and adds variance. And variance is super important to depth and complexity and an information horizon as well. So all of these concepts work together to kind of create what I think is a very good strategy game. But that being said, I'm perfectly aware that a lot of these concepts are good concepts, but at the same time, this is my opinion on how I think strategy games should be developed. And so I've kind of got this philosophy, if you will, on kind of how I'm designing strategy games. But that being said, I would love some questions. Does anybody have any questions that they wanted to ask or anything like that? Somebody asked earlier what I would change in Pokemon. And I think, given everything that we've talked about, I think it could actually use a little bit more depth. So if someone gave me a Pokemon license and said, make a good Pokemon game, this is actually the part I would focus on. Because I think it does complexity well. I think it does variance well. I think it's got a good information horizon. I think it's got its randomness sorted out, but I think it's lacking a little bit of depth in the combat system. Right? So what specifically would I do to Pokemon? I don't know, because a lot of that, I think, is dependent on iteration. So that's the other thing, is a lot of the stuff is really hard to design unless you play it. So I would try a bunch of stuff. I would probably start with the move sets and look at how they can interact better with each other. I like the typing. I think the typing's really cool, right? How like fire is weak to water and that kind of stuff. But I would totally look into how to make some of the combat a little bit more deep. Way to test depth is to separate all the viable options and test them out and balance individually. What if they can be combined? I think they should be combined, actually. I think the way that you create ultimate depth is by having a series of systems that interact with each other. So unfortunately, a lot of people add complexity. They will add an inventory system. They will add a movement system. But if the inventory system can't interact with the movement system, I think you're missing an opportunity. So what if there is an inventory item that could buff your move speed, right? Suddenly you have these two systems and now they're interconnected, right? So you guys ever seen Backpack Hero? It's a new game that I've been seeing around on itch. Let's look at that. So Backpack Hero takes the concept of a inventory system. Let me see if I can get a bigger screenshot. It basically uses an inventory system as the primary means with which you attack, and it basically simplifies all of the RPG mechanics and all that stuff. And you basically have access to all the items that do different attacks. So the sword, for example, does 3 damage or whatever. You know, there's stuff you can eat and regen your health, and so it kind of simplifies the whole system. And I think it makes a really cool strategy here because I'm not showing my screen, am I? My bad. I thought I was showing the thing. But here's a screenshot of Backpack here. I'll link this in case you guys wanted to play this. What do you think about the Age of Empires series on the subject? You know, I haven't played Age of Empires, so I can't really comment on that. Problem with the types of Pokemon is the battles become so one-sided. They do. That is a major problem with the typing. I like the typing interaction, but I don't like double damage. The card game had that too. If you attack a fire Pokemon with a water Pokemon, you do double damage, which meant that in a tournament, if your fire deck got put up against a water deck, you might as well just, you know, concede. So I like the typing interactions. I think the typing double damage and stuff like that is a little too strong. That's why elemental magics are so common in RPGs to add relatively simple variances for options. Yeah, good point, Mark. Big strength of Pokemon is that my first and second grader can play it fully and enjoy the game. Yes, and you know what that is? That is a lack of complexity. And that's why I actually think the best strategy games have low complexity and high depth. Because if they're not complex, then younger people or people that don't have that much brain power to contribute to a game can get into the game generally easily. And that's actually what I'm trying to design, is a low complexity, deep strategy game, because I think that's really, really important. I think that's an important part of it. Where do you get joy from? What do you do? Joy? Joy? It's funny, I was watching a show called Killjoys, and they're hitmen, and their currency is called joy. So they kill for money. So you said joy, I'm like, money? Oh no, wait, they're not the same thing. I like game dev. I like strategy games. Good question though. Pokemon suffers from too many one-shot kill attacks, so more HP and longer combat would make all the status moves viable. Use some tweaking done. You know what else Pokemon would be interesting in a Pokemon battle is some kind of positional aspect, right? So if you had, what's that game? I think it's in my library. The Dungeon Beneath. So this is an auto battler. It's not a perfect example, but let me just show you a screenshot. So if Pokemon, for example, if some of the battles took place on a grid like this, that could add a ton of depth. It would add complexity to the battles, right? For sure. But it would add a ton of depth. You also have to keep in mind that Pokemon was designed kind of for the Game Boy and stuff like that. So the way that that's laid out was for the Game Boy interface. So those are important things to to think about as well. Oh, this is a screenshot. I keep not showing it. This is a screenshot of. Well, that's a video. Never mind. But any kind of grid-based combat, I think, would add some depth. Front row, back row, yeah. Even simple stuff like that. Pokemon games position gimmicks hasn't been a consistent feature. Yeah, Pokemon Stadium was actually pretty cool. You guys remember that game back in the day? Didn't they have a new version of that? I don't know. I wasn't keeping track. I still haven't finished. I haven't started Legends of Arceus, and I haven't finished the remakes. I finished Shield. That was the last one I finished. Have you played Fire Emblem? What are your opinions on the game? I haven't played Fire Emblem, but I think it's a pretty solid game. I've seen videos of it. I've studied it, but I haven't actually played it. Civ 2 is my favorite strategy game, I think. Civ 2? Why Civ 2? I'm curious, because I find this with sequels to strategy games too. I think sometimes with the sequels, they do exactly the thing that we talked about. They're like, oh, we're making a sequel, so we need more stuff. Let's add more stuff. And generally, when they add complexity, they add depth, but they're just adding so much complexity. And you get in a Civ game now, and it's like, oh my god, dude, there's so much going on. Like I love Stellaris. You guys ever played Stellaris? It's a fantastic game, but it took me 2 hours on YouTube to figure out how to play the game. And like, if I wasn't at a time in my life where like I was willing to dedicate that time to play it, there's no way I would have ever entered that game. And honestly, it's been a year or two. I want to play it, but like I'm not gonna remember anything. So it's got a lot of depth, but it's got a lot of complexity to it as well, right? Stadium and Coliseum. Very nice Pokemon strategic game that turned it off by now, but I love the battles. They were fun. Pokken, I think. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Pokken Tournament or whatever. Is it in the US? Because, yeah, I don't know. Can you buy it? Pokken Tournament DX. Oh, I guess it's on Switch, isn't it? Stellaris keeps adding complexity. You have to micromanage plants now. Man, I want to play it so bad, Mark. I do. I want to love the game, but it's just above my like mental capacity. Advance Wars is great. There was a Advance Wars, not clone, but game like Advance Wars that I played. What was the name of that? It came out on PC like a year or two ago. Wargroove, that was it. That's a really good game. I really like that game. And Wargroove and Advance Wars are good examples of low complexity, high depth. It's not super high depth. It's not like, Stellaris level depth, but it's for the complexity that game has. It's got a lot of depth. The remake got postponed because of the war, right? Yeah, I'll play that. I'm excited for that. Yeah, but that's fun. Is there any other strategy game questions or any other examples that you guys want to bring up of good strategy and good games? Because I think that's something we can kind of wrap up here. Might have been a Japan-only release. Some of my favorite strategy games of all time: Total War series, Final Fantasy Tactics, Castles, Magic the Gathering, Master of Orion. I love card games. Don't get me started on Magic the Gathering and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! I have strong feelings about negatively because I played competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For years. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a perfect example. So what ended up happening with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is every new set that they released, they kept adding stronger cards. And by adding stronger cards, they were making all the old players buy the new cards. But given 10 sets, the game is just insane right now. They kept introducing complexity. They added XYZ monsters and synchro summons and just fusion the complexity in that game just went through the roof. And whereas you look at Magic has continued to innovate and find depth in new sets without completely destroying the game with complexity, right? It's not even just power creep. It was like complexity creep, because it wasn't just powerful cards. It was like new systems. And on top of that, Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't have a resource management system, which is another big part of competitive card games, is you need some sort of resource system. So in Yu-Gi-Oh! The resource system was the cards in your hand. And the problem is they started making more and more cards that let you draw cards or search for cards or all that stuff. And the second they did that, it was like getting unlimited mana in Magic, right? It was just like they broke their core system by adding complexity. So that's something to keep in mind. Disgaea is one of those strategy games where power creep exceeds the difficulty of the game itself. Yeah, I can't stand that, dude. One of the reasons why I designed Murder Bunnies, which if you guys don't know, I designed a card game called Murder Bunnies, which if anybody backed it on Kickstarter, we're about to ship soon. This close. We're this close. I made that game specifically because I hate meta decks. The problem with a lot of competitive card games strategically is that what ends up happening is 10 sets release, and then there are tournaments on these card games, and you'll start to notice that, okay, there's only 3 viable decks. Remember we talked about number of viable options? Well, at a tournament level for most competitive card games, there's only 2 or 3. That's it. Everybody's running those decks because those are the only viable options. And so weirdly, card games with thousands of cards end up with 3 viable options. And it used to drive me crazy because, like, why am I going to a tournament to play the same decks that everyone else is playing? Like, I think part of the fun of card games is assembling your own deck and creating your own strategy. But if it's not viable, you can't do it in a tournament, right? So I designed Murder Bunnies with 1 deck for 2 players. And I designed it in a way to make sure that there is no competitive meta cards. There's no way in that game to predict what comes out. There are OP strategies, right? But those OP strategies don't come up every game, and it's a lot harder to get them into the game because of the way that the game is set up. So I actually designed that game completely around my hate of meta decks because I just couldn't stand it. What do you think of single player versus multiplayer strategy games? I personally like competitive multiplayer strategy games, but I think there's a lot more limitations when you add multiplayer to it, right? Because you have to really balance things. Remember we talked about number of viable options? When there's a multiplayer component to things, people hardcore will search out the viable options. And whatever viable option they find, they will post to every forum on the planet. And then every game, you'll find people that are looking up the best units or whatever is in the strategy game. And you'll end up dealing with kind of the best of the best unit composition. There's just the meta of that kind of stuff. So it's one of the reasons why I focus heavily on, like, Battleborn Tactics, for example, has a random draft in the beginning. There are definitely OP unit combinations, right? But I've done my work to make sure that they don't show up every time, because I think you should never reduce the number of viable options down so narrowly. I hate that, and it's a huge problem. Don't get me wrong, I'm not some genius that solved this meta problem for strategy games. It is a huge problem. But it's one of the reasons why, like in Magic the Gathering, I enjoy drafting cards, right? When draft is like when everybody opens a pack, picks 1 card and passes it to the left, and you all build a deck right there to kind of battle out. I love that stuff because it takes the meta category out of the gameplay. But yeah, that's a whole nother subject that we could spend forever on, I'm sure. I'm playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Against people that would run all the Dark Magician, Blue Eyes, and Six Samurai. Man, some of those. Okay, I don't know if you were around, but you remember the dragon decks? Around the same time the Blue Eyes decks were going off, but they had the legendary dragons, the 4 of them, that were just stupid. And there was one point where they weren't even limited, so you could have 3 of each of them in your deck, and they were just ridiculous. Oh my god! Like that was. Why would you make cards like that? It's like players will always optimize the fun out of the game. 100%, they do. They do, and that's why I'm not saying multiplayer strategy games are bad. I like them. As a designer, I tend to stay away from them because of that exact reason, Mark. I think it's a bigger problem that requires a different kind of solution. Matter of fact, the solution that a lot of multiplayer strategy games come up with is not to fix the meta, it's to change the meta. So what they do is they'll release an update every 2 or 3 months that will buff or debuff certain units. And so now there's a new meta and it keeps players interested. Destiny does this all the time. And that's more of like a looter shooter MMO, but they're constantly buffing and debuffing weapons just to keep the meta fresh. So they smarter people than me do not have a solution to this. So there's no solution to it, but there's a lot of like workarounds for it, if that makes sense. Dude, I've been looking for a copy of Netrunner forever, man. Vendolis. I can't find one. Been on Amazon. I've seen some on eBay, but they're like stupid expensive. Every card game shop or game like board game store that I go into, I always ask about Netrunner. I can't get a copy. I never played it, but I've watched a bunch of videos on it. It looks awesome. It's the difference between players who enjoy exploring the mechanics of a game and players who enjoy competing and winning. Yeah. The Bartle's taxonomy of player types. If you guys aren't familiar with that, you should be. Let me show it real quick. Because it's a cool kind of little way to kind of think about things. So let me share my screen. So it's the idea that there's kind of 4 different types of players, if that makes sense. There's killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. And it's the idea that people play games for different reasons. And some players are in different spots. Like my brother is definitely right here. Okay. When we got a game night later on tonight. He wants to dominate in everything that we do. Right? He just wants to dominate. He just wants to destroy. He wants to kill and dominate. Okay. I am definitely in this range. When I play games I want to explore or socialize, I could care less about achievements and I could care less about dominating. There's so many multiplayer games. I have no idea what the score is. I'm just playing. I'm just hanging out. So 100% I'm in this range. He's definitely in this range. So it makes it hard for us to find a game that we can play together because it's like that. But this is not the end all be all of stuff, but it's important to kind of keep in mind as well. MOBA games, one person was saying that the dev should stop the players from using the same characters in tournaments to keep the players from using the same characters over and over again. Yeah, I think the way that Magic and I think Pokemon does this now too. So the solution that a lot of card game developers have ended up with is cycling out the cards. So right now in Magic the Gathering for competitive, I could get this wrong because I haven't played Magic in a while, but I think there's 6 sets that you're allowed to use in tournaments. So the last 6 sets that came out, you can use cards from those in tournaments. And when a new set comes out, the oldest one gets removed. So they cycle through it. It happens to work out really well in their favor financially because people have to constantly buy new cards. But I do think it is a somewhat viable ongoing solution to meta decks, if that makes sense. It doesn't prevent the meta. The meta still pops up. And sometimes it's there for 6 sets, but it's important to think about. Hardest part about development of strategy games is making it feel both fair and challenging. Any tips on fairness? Fairness really comes down to not being fair and not being fair in the player's favor. Let me just say that. If you want a game to feel fair, you need it to feel generous. So you need to go above and beyond and give the player stuff. Reduce any kind of negative randomness, missing shots, all that kind of stuff. People will they'll complain about that endlessly. So if you have if people are saying it doesn't feel fair, try implementing fake randomness. If you got any randomness in the games, try making the game very generous. One of the things that I did actually on this, and again, I apologize, I'm not trying to plug my game like 10 million times, okay? But this is something I've been working on really, really hard. In my game, Battleborn Tactics, there's this map, right? Now, the battle nodes are just these skulls, this black skull and this red skull right here. I don't know if you guys can see that. Let me full screen this. So these are the kind of battle nodes, but you'll notice that the ratio of all the rest of these nodes are benefit nodes. So this is a shop. This is a combiner. It lets you combine 2 units. This is a cloner. You can get free units here. There's a bunch of like stuff that gives you free stuff basically. And one of the things that I did, there's actually a 2-to-1 ratio to rewards and battles. And actually, Inscription did this. The game on Steam, you can look it up, Inscription. It's a fantastic game. It won awards and all kinds of stuff. It never occurred to me that I could be so generous with the map nodes. I assume map nodes should always be mostly battles, right? Like that's why people are playing a combat tactics game, because for the battles. But it actually fascinated me when I realized what was happening in Inscription, that the game was being super generous with those nodes. And I tried to make it a 2-to-1 ratio for rewards versus battles. So that's something that I worked really, really hard on to do. And I think if you can, you should, because fair generally means generous. That's what most players refer to when they say that. Don't turn Battleborn Tactics into a drinking game. You will get drunk. Okay. Look, I'm a game dev too. I got to promote my stuff. It's hard out here for a marketer. Who actually likes to spam Twitter with their game? Hey guys, I made a new update. Check out my GIF. Nobody actually likes to do that, okay? You gotta find more fun ways to do that. To make my card matching game fair, I implemented a mercy system. The AI gets a set number of matches in a row. It will miss on purpose to give the player a chance. That is a fantastic example, David. So like I said, if you want to implement fairness, make it unfair in the player's favor. The irony of that system, right? It's weird, but fair, mathematical fair, and humans' perception of fair are not the same thing, right? If someone gets a new job and they get paid better than their old job, they're like, oh, they pay fairly here. That's great. But they find out their coworker who does the same job gets paid twice as them. Suddenly that's not fair. That's not fair, right? So it's very comparison based, right? It's very there's a term for this, like relational. I'm thinking of MySQL now, relational databases. But fairness is not the mathematical fairness, which is the technical meaning of the word. Fairness is actually, in a human's perspective, comparable to other things, if that makes sense. So it's weird. That gets into psychology and sociology and all that stuff, and it gets into more game designy stuff than just strategy games, relative to other, whatever the word is. But yeah, any final questions before we wrap up? It's been kind of a different stream here. While we're waiting for questions, I would love if you guys would tell me what you thought of this format. Obviously, I've Photoshopped, I wrote some stuff in, but what did you guys think of the more like knowledge bomb, information drop dev casts than just kind of what we traditionally do? Fair is relative. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Jobu. Thank you, Lottie. You guys are awesome. But yeah, it's been fun. I appreciate everybody hanging out. I miss Rick, not gonna lie. Rick makes this way more fun. What does Tim do when Rick can't make it? He just like opens Photoshop and knowledge drops. No, not the no Rick format. I want Rick in the future ones. He's much more entertaining than I am. But yeah, generally we got more chatter and less knowledge, but this was more knowledge and less chatter, if that makes sense. So I guess that's what I was asking. It was fair. I like the media info. Okay, good enough. Makes me miss the game dev owner. Yeah, man, I need to get back to it. I'm working on my whole set stuff. Eventually I'm gonna get back to it. I just got a lot going on. I'm happy Steam Fest is over, and I did a secret project that I can't tell you about yet, but that was also this week and last week. So, shop to Draggy Cow in Ray. You want to make viable options? Is it good to make each option have one round or turn cooldown, or is it bad thing so the player will not use the same move again? Just make it random chance to hit. I don't think making a cooldown immediately removes the viable options. I think you've just limited the player's options at that point. But I think cooldowns is a really good way to balance viable options. So cooldowns is a really good way to add a really overpowered beam weapon to your game, but then give it a 5-turn cooldown, whereas the regular gun just has a one turn cooldown, if that makes sense. So it's a really good balancing tool, and I think balance is important for viable options, if that makes sense. So got her 30 minutes late, so I can't comment, but I enjoyed the examples you showed. Cool. Well, the video is on YouTube if you want to rewatch it. Totally may or may not be worth doing. I don't know. I was just kind of brain dumping on Photoshop. Anyway, I hope you all have a fantastic evening. Thank you for coming out with me and hanging out. Thank you for showing up, even though the celebrity Rick is not here. Maybe he's working hard on Draggy Dog. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see next week. But again, just a reminder that we've got a turn-based strategy course launching in the next week or two. So keep an eye on your email. I'm really, really excited for that because I use Construct 3 to make my strategy games, and this is a Unity turn-based strategy course. So I am pumped because if there was ever a reason for me to learn Unity, it would be a turn-based strategy course. But have a good night, everybody. Bye.